Welcome to your Communication and Culturally Diverse Workplaces from FitPros Live. My name is Dr. Tiffany Loggins. I'm a clinical psychologist. And before we get started, I would love to just quickly go over who I am. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and mental health wellness speaker. I specialize in working with communities of color, eating disorders, and helping organizations with D&I efforts. So today what we're going to talk about, our agenda, is understanding that sometimes we get communication gets just lost in translation. And a lot of times this can happen from us having different cultural background, religion, gender expression, racial background. But in order for us to be able to communicate effectively, we first must acknowledge our own biases that shape our worldview. So, in this health talk, you will learn new communication techniques rooted in listening, mindfulness, and empathy. We'll explore what it takes to work with different people from different backgrounds, pay close attention to cultural nuances compounded by language, social, economic backgrounds, and more. And so, on the agenda today, some of the things that we're going to talk about to start with is thinking about what are the benefits of working in both a diverse and inclusive workspaces and what makes it difficult to utilize culturally sensitive communication. We'll also look at how unconscious biases are developed and ways to combat that. And then at the very end, we'll also talk a bit about different tips and techniques to increase cultural communication through acknowledging our own privilege and biases and ways to use effective communication and listening skills. And so a lot of the things that we will do is going to look at not only thinking about other cultural and diversity factors, it's also going to be looking at your own personal biases and your own cultural development. So working in cultural sensitive, diverse workspaces, um, we live and work in a multicultural environment, and we're seeing that more and more, especially with technology and people working from home. It's not uncommon for work environments for people to be working across the globe in different time zones. And so we believe in our intrinsic humanity that we are good people, we're good natured, and we pride ourselves on being curious and open and tolerant of other cultures. Yet, however, we interact, we try to do teamwork, we make assessments, and we judge behaviors and attitudes based off of our own experiences without always considering the cultural context and biases. So, a lot of times we have blind spots that we just aren't fully aware of. A better understanding of individual cultures and the context that individuals bring can only strengthen organizational diversity and inclusion. So being able to look at our own selves and see what biases and blind spots we have, we'll be able to culturally connect with other people in a sensitive way. So what are the benefits? I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time because it makes a lot of sense that providing a space that's diverse and inclusive that has a foundation of cultural sensitivity is going to reap a ton of benefits. One of them is diverse cultural perspectives can inspire creativity and drive innovation, right? Diversity of thought has been shown to breed creativity and drive innovation, helping to solve problems, meet customer needs, and also the ability to brainstorm different solutions. When people are coming from completely different backgrounds, their perspective on life drastically is different, which can only benefit in inspiring creativity and driving innovation. The local market knowledge and insight makes a business more competitive and marketable, as well as profitable. And this is because if someone is from a different place, they're able to maybe tap into a different market that isn't local. Cultural sensitivity, insight, and local knowledge means higher quality and targeting specific audiences. So, for instance, it might be really important to make sure you have people on your team who look at a marketing slogan and are able to tell if it's sensitive, if it's read correctly. For example, in China, there was marketing for KFC. And as we all know, finger looking good was a very popular slogan and still is. But if you just translate it, which is what they did by mistake, it actually reads so tasty you can eat your fingers off in Chinese if you do the translation. So it's really important to have different people from backgrounds to be able to look at certain things that are being produced and marketed. A big thing is being able to draw from culturally diverse talent pools always allows an organization to not only attain, but also retain the best talent as well. And it's also been shown that organizations with a culture of diversity and inclusion are both happier and more competitive and definitely more productive. Also, if you are able to have a diverse pool, it also allows you to have a diverse skill base that allows organizations to offer a broad and more range of products and services. Diverse teams are more productive, they perform better. And the other thing is, they also have greater opportunity, not only for professional growth, but also personal, um, as you can bond over similarities and differences can help you to become a global citizen, just make you a better overall rounded individual. A diverse set of colleagues can be professionally enriching as well because you're able to glean a ton of skills and knowledge from one another. I have a very good example of this as a psychologist. In grad school, when I made to postdoc, I came in with a group of other individuals all from different backgrounds, and we all had very different therapeutic approaches, and I learned so much from my colleagues who also learned a lot from me. So we can also see this happening in the workplace too. Other benefits of culturally sensitive workspaces, it's also important to note the reason why these workspaces we consider them culturally sensitive is because of the communication styles that is bred in these environments. But employees feel respected, valued, and feel comfortable with themselves. They're able to share, they're able to disclose if they have issues or problems that arise. Companies in the top quarter for racial and ethnic diversity are 35% more likely to surpass their peers, while those in the same bracket for gender diversity are 15% more likely to do the same. Higher representation of women in C suite level positions results in 34% greater returns to shareholders, and companies with higher than average diversity had a 19% higher innovation revenues. So we talk a lot about diversity. And oftentimes people assume that diversity, if you have diversity, you have a check mark of how many people meet a certain demographic in your workspace or your organization, you're good. And what we know is diversity does represent a range of traits: gender, race, physical ability, religion, etc. And it refers to who's at working, including who's recruited, hired, and promoted. That's what we think of when we think of diversity. However, diversity isn't enough in order to create an inclusive, safe environment. And inclusion means the degree to which employees feel valued, respected, accepted, and encouraged to fully participate in the organization. So a company's workforce may be diverse, but if employees don't feel safe, welcomed, valued, or have the ability to move up, it's not an inclusive, safe space. And so one thing we know is diversity forces us to work harder, critically review our work, think in alternative ways and solutions, versus homogenous groups where we anticipate there may be less disagreement. But diversity can only really prosper if there's inclusion, right? So we'll talk a bit about how it's important to practice cultural sensitivity and effective communication when we're in diverse environments in order to promote inclusive workspaces. So, what are some of the challenges of culturally diverse workspaces? So, it's not always great unless we have a lot of awareness, which we'll talk about how to increase that. But sometimes we can have colleagues from different cultures that may be less likely to let their voices heard. So, there could be some cultures that are deemed to be more deferential. We might see that in more Eastern cultures compared to maybe Western Europe or Western US, where there may not be as much emphasis placed on being polite or differential. So these differences, if we're not aware of them, can be misconstrued. Integration across multicultural teams can also be very difficult if there are underlying negative cultural stereotypes, right? And so this can be very sensitive. Someone from outside of it may not be aware of two groups of people that seem very similar, but their cultural histories and context may not be. And there could be underlying negative cultural stereotypes. Professional communication can be misinterpreted or difficult to understand across languages and cultures. The way our body language, the way we say things, this can happen a lot of times. Also, navigating visa requirements, employee laws, and all of that can also make it very difficult as well. Um, Different understandings of professional etiquette. So we even see this in the United States, right? There's a difference between West Coast and East Coast. I'm in San Francisco, in California, and some people might say, it's particularly in the Bay Area, people are a little bit more lax. Our attire is a little bit less formal, and maybe on the East Coast, people are a little bit, maybe they dress up a little bit more and they're really on time. I feel like in the Bay Area, coming in 5 minutes late isn't a big deal. But maybe on the East Coast, it might be very different. And all of these are different cultural expectations and different understandings of professional etiquette. And there could be conflicting working styles and communication across teams as well. So looking at the challenges that an organization may have is important, but we also need to think about what are the negative impact of non-inclusive workspaces. And so this goes back to when we have diverse spaces, but they're not inclusive and they're not safe due to poor cultural communication. And what will happen is individuals and employees from marginalized groups will often experience social loneliness. So they might feel very isolated and have difficulty speaking up or sharing their ideas. While they may feel lonely, social loneliness, they may also experience gender or racial visibility at the same time. So there's like a social loneliness and invisibility, but they may feel as though certain demographics or cultural aspects of them are very visible, and that's all people see of them, which can often make them feel the burden of having to explain or prove themselves to others. So they might feel a constant stress and paranoia that people are judging them, or experiencing imposter syndrome that they're not doing as well, or maybe they feel like they don't deserve to be there, or feeling as though other people feel that way about them. They may also have a fear of seeking support. Maybe they are experiencing microaggressions or a very non-inclusive, hostile environment. They may feel as though they can't really speak up or go to anyone for help. Another thing that can also come up is we don't really think about the physical and the emotional ramifications of being in a hostile, non-inclusive work environment where there's poor cultural communication. It can really start to wear down on people's physiological health. And then the very last thing I want to talk about too is stereotype threat and self-fulfilling prophecies that these individuals can also experience. So if you're not familiar with the stereotype threat, this can either be a situational environment, but it's a predicament in which people are or feel themselves. So it could be truly happening, or it could just be how they feel due to systemic discrimination and stereotypes and prejudices about their social group, which leads to increased anxiety. And as a result, too much anxiety can hurt people's performance. So we'll talk a bit about how this can come up. So another thing that can happen to individuals too is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So someone predicts an outcome, meaning, oh my gosh, I feel as though I'm gonna not pass this test. And the prediction actually occurs because the person believes it and their behavior tends to align with it. This can happen with people who struggle with social anxiety. So they have a belief that they're going to go to this party and no one's going to like them. No one's going to want to hang out with them. And everyone's going to think they're not interesting. They go to the party and they feel extremely anxious and awkward. So they sit in the corner on their phone. And anytime someone comes up to them, they have their head down, they're stuttering, and they only give one word responses. And what happens is because they feel like they aren't interesting and people aren't going to like them, they feel anxious and they actually behave in alignment with that belief. So, an example of this could be too of a stereotype threat and a self fulfilling prophecy that oftentimes marginalized groups may experience. An example could be a coworker who identifies as POC is excluded from a work hangout, right? They may feel or interpret that they do not belong, and they interpret not receiving an invite. And these events lead to feedback loops and self fulfilling prophecies. So, you know what? I didn't get that invite because they don't like me. They don't think I'm competent. Now, maybe this could be true, or it could be poor communication, um, lack of cultural sensitivity that this person was left out. But because there's ambiguity and this person may already be vulnerable for stereotype threat, imposter syndrome, and self fulfilling prophecy, it can create a really vicious feedback loop. And that's why it's very important for us to think about ways to improve our cultural communication to make sure we're boosting a non inclusive work environment. So before we dive into some of the tips and ways to improve our cultural communication, I think it's important that we define important key terms. So defining culture and diversity. What is culture? We talk about this a lot. It is a learned set of shared interpretations about beliefs, values, and norms that affect the behaviors of a relatively large group of people. Culture is a medium that touches and alters all aspects of human life. It can be personality, how we express ourselves, how we emote, the way that we think, move, and the way that we solve problems. And cultural awareness grows from exposure and interaction. So that's what culture is, but what is diversity? Diversity, like it sounds, is can exist on various levels and is broadly characterized as primary, secondary, or organizational and cultural on the spectrum. So, as you can see in the middle, the visible primary dimensions are things that we typically kind of name off when we think about culture and diversity. So, this encompasses things that we can see relatively pretty easily: gender, ethnicity, race, sexual orientation, possibly, um, mental and physical ability. Some of these you may not be able to see. Age is also on there as well. And then the secondary dimensions will be religion, education, geographical location, appearance, working styles, learning styles, language, and family status. So as you go out further and further, these tend to be less visible core diversity dimensions. So we think of culture and we usually think of it on within groups of people, but organizations can also have a culture too, and it can range a variety of different diversity. So dimensions can exist within a workplace status, management level, experience, and department are collectively all part of organizational diversity, right? So you may be in an organization and there may be an office that's in the US, and then there may be an office in Australia, and there may be an office in Europe. And there may be a specific culture within those organizations, but yet you're all working together. But you might have very different levels of diversity within structure, flexibility, communication styles, time, definitely, being or doing, power and authority, body language, conflict resolution, individual or team preferences, and even body language can all represent cultural diversity. And we can look at that within an organization. Cultural diversity isn't just about the obvious divides of race and religion. Um, we can still be of the same race, same religion, and same gender, and be culturally diverse due to our upbringing and our formative and educational experiences. So let's dive into understanding unconscious biases, because this is the heartbeat of culturally insensitive communication. So it's really important for us to understand what unconscious biases are, because we all experience them and we all have them. And we are all guilty of it. And so, what is an unconscious bias? So, we frequently, all of us as humans, we make automatic decisions at a subconscious level, which is and was needed for survival and an evolutionary byproduct. So, people before us, right, hunters and gatherers, they had to quickly make automatic decisions subconsciously for their survival. And we also have to do that too. So, for them, seeing a snake and knowing that certain colors represented a poisonous snake versus um, a snake that has a different color, less pattern, you might know that that one isn't dangerous or venomous. Needing to be able to make a really quick assessment unconsciously of things was needed for our survival. Fortunately, we don't need that as much, but we still have a byproduct of it. And so we have these automatic responses that occur via rapid processing of new information. So we're getting new information every single day, but we're processing it rapidly through existing patterns of thought. Your existing patterns of thought are your upbringing, what you've seen, what you've been influenced, what you see on TV, what your parents, your culture, all of that are existing patterns of thought, which for all of us are going to be very, very different. And a pervasive byproduct of this is unconscious biases, also called UB, because our automatic responses are shaped by our lived experiences and broader social context. We develop these unconscious biases that are implicit. They go under our awareness and they're pretty reflexive if we're not smart about it. These often are existing patterns of thought lead to certain stereotypes, and they can be positive or negative, but they influence our decisions and behaviors without consciously acting on the stereotype or awareness of even doing so. So this can occur when people know that the stereotype is true. I mean, is false. So if they consciously know, like, I know that that's not true about X people. Unconsciously, though, you may not know that. And as a result, it will influence those stereotypes that you hold unconsciously will influence your decision making and behaviors. And you'll think, no, it's not. And it really is. And we see this a lot with systematic hiring biases, differing expectations in treatment, which can lead to stereotype threat, acts of sexism, racism, and affinity bias, which we'll talk a little bit later. But this can really breed self-fulfilling prophecies that continue to be perpetuated, and inequities between in and out groups, even when initial stereotypes were incorrect. So one common unconscious biases that we all have is an affinity or an in-group bias. And you may be thinking, well, if we all have it and we're all guilty of it, well, I just can't do anything about it. And the truth is, no, you can. You just have to have awareness around it. But yes, we might naturally, all of us have an affinity or an in-group bias, which just means people extend not only greater trust, but also greater positive regard, cooperation, and empathy to in-group members compared with out-group members. This is instinctive and unconscious, and it manifests not as a preference for in-group, but it's typically as an aversion toward out-group. And as we can see, organizations becoming more diverse, it can be difficult to breed inclusive environments if we unconsciously have affinity or in-group biases. That's almost instinctive and unconscious. So we have to be very aware of this. And if you're like, oh, I don't believe that's true, well, here's a study that they've shown. Very young children exhibit in-group biases. So as children become aware of societal norms that favor certain groups and bias towards social privilege, so all children at 30 months show biases, right? So that's like a year and a half, will typically show bias, that affinity bias. But this changes only for Black children at 36 months. They tend to show a bias towards whiteness. White children rarely exhibit anything other than a pro-white bias. And this has been shown over and over again. Brown versus the Board of Education in the US proved this. Basically, we're showing the effects, the negative effects of segregation on Black children. And we continue to see this. So this is just an example of unconscious biases that we can see in very, very little children, 36 months. If you think about here, all of us are probably above the age of 18. That means we've had 18 years of programming of certain biases as well. Okay, so another type of unconscious biases are microaggressions. This results of our implicit biases. These can be assumptions, stereotypes, and intentional actions that we make towards other people based off various identity. These can sometimes come off as being naive or well-meaning, and it's usually when people don't have conscious awareness of their implicit bias that they do this. And it presents as a form of preference towards one own in group typically, or it could be another way as well, an inversion. These are usually invisible implicit biases, but can visibly emerge, even if it's intentionally, can cause a lot of harm. So these are some of the microaggressions. So you can have a micro assault, but this is very blatant. Obvious behavior, so displaying racist symbols or speaking in racial epithets. Micro insults, so saying to a person of color, how did you get this job? Micro invalidation, so saying to an Asian American, you speak English so well, you're so articulate, or no, where are you really from? These are different types of microaggressions that we have to be careful. So how do we develop culturally sensitive communication styles, right? And this can also be known as developing cultural competence, which is defined as a set of values, beliefs, and behaviors, skills, and policies that come together to enable us to work effectively in cross-cultural situations. Oh, so there are 5 elements of cultural competence that we're going to talk about today. The first one that you need to have is you have to have awareness of what's going on and say, okay, I'm aware that unconscious biases exist. I'm aware that I don't see, some people who say like, oh, I don't see color. No, the awareness is I do see color, right? So acknowledging cultural differences. Please don't be that person who says, I don't see color, because you do see color, right? And people want you to be able to see color, see certain demographics, or at least be aware that cultural differences exist, right? Also, be awareness of your own culture. And then the next thing you need to have is awareness of attitudes. So you want to engage in self-assessment of like, where did I grow up? You know, I noticed that I grew up and I didn't really see a lot of X people. The next thing, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, is acquire cultural knowledge and skills. And that's what we're going to be doing today, because this enables us to effectively communicate in cross-cultural situations. And then the next thing is view behavior within a cultural context as much as possible. And oftentimes what could be helpful is trying to find meaning and looking at people on an individual place, not grouping people based off of certain diversity or demographics, but just seeing people uniquely, not judging them based off, oh, this is the person who identifies as transgender, or this is the person who identifies as this, but like, oh, this is the person who I really enjoy working with. Oh, or this is the person I always see grabbing coffee and I would love to go talk with them. Or this is person the last time we talked chatted about Dragon Ball Z, right? Viewing people on a unique individual circumstance that has not a whole lot to do with certain gender or racial demographics, although it is important to acknowledge that that is there, but see people beyond that as well, that we're multidimensional individuals. The next thing you want to do is understand your privilege. So, what does that mean? Having privilege means that you possess an unearned advantage in society through some aspect of your identity. Um, as a Black woman, I hold, someone might not think that, but I also hold privilege, right? I'm an able bodied individual. I grew up in middle class. I have an education, a higher education. Those are privilege as well. And people with privilege tends to reflect large power differentials in society. So members of a dominant group possess a privilege over those whose identity might be marginalized by them in comparison. So while it can be uncomfortable to recognize that we have unearned advantages over others through no fault of our own, most times, working through your discomfort can allow you to utilize your privilege in a way that promotes equitable outcomes and inclusive space. There are many ways in which privilege can present itself. And while there are general trends, anomalies do exist. It's possible that certain types of privilege may not hold true in all circumstances. So when people are accustomed to having privilege, that experience is normal for them. And thus it's hard to recognize. And oftentimes when people recognize it, it makes them feel very guilty and shame and defensive sometimes if they're not doing this work and just acknowledging that, you know what, I do hold privilege. And one way to ensure that we don't harm other people is to acknowledge your privilege in conversations. So, oftentimes, those with privilege fail to recognize how much harm they can do when they do not think critically enough about the power that they hold. So, having privilege can lead you to believe that you have earned more than you have actually worked for. And this can lead to feelings of superiority over your oppressed counterparts. So, acknowledging your privilege, you limit the possibility of invalidating the other person's life experiences or silencing them altogether. It shows self-awareness, empathy, compassion to those who are marginalized. It's being very sensitive. So in order to avoid harm, right? Because having privilege a lot of times in and of itself can cause harm. Um, so when engaging in conversations, try to preface your statements with aspects of your identity in which you have privilege. So just acknowledging that can be sensitive, and also shows empathy and openness and that this is a safe space. So for example, if you're a cisgender white man talking about social issues with someone who identifies as uh, Black, Indigenous, person of color, and they're non binary, you can acknowledge that gender and race affords you certain privilege in society. So just acknowledging that can be extremely helpful. It's also important to be mindful of your privilege and listen a lot more than you talk when engaging with members of marginalized communities. Listen a lot more because your privilege can be very loud even without you talking. The next thing is enhancing your knowledge. So, the ability to increase cultural competence oftentimes relies on critical thinking as well as exposure. Exposure can come in a variety of different ways. Some of these are tips and exercises and literature to enhance your own personal knowledge, as well as awareness of unconscious biases. So, one is exploring identity models, Hem's white racial identity model, people of color race identity model, read books on race, exploration activities of your privilege, um, take inventory of the diversity within your friend and work relationships. If you're like, I don't really have that many X types of people in my life that I hang out with, check that out. Also, look at your social media accounts. Do you have body diversity? Do you have racial and ethnic diversity within the media, movies, television, social media that you consume? I often call it a visual diet. Um, do you have conversations with friends, coworkers, and families on diversity and culture? Do you engage in any social advocacy activities? Do you give money or volunteer your time? And if not, start to make a commitment to doing at least one or two of these activities per month, right? It's through our own personal exploration that we can actually change the next generation to be able to confront discrimination and prejudice and learn to celebrate diversity and stand up for everyone's rights to be treated with dignity and respect. These are a couple of books that are really great to kind of help start this dialogue as well. And ways that you can acknowledge and address unconscious biases. One is build awareness that we have this all of us have this shared psychological basis of unconscious biases. So attend a workshop, which you're already doing. View your colleagues on an individuation, so unique attributes versus a social categorization or a group member. So get to know them on a personal level. Invite someone that you wouldn't typically hang out with. Increase contact between two or more social groups to help with anxiety of outgroup interactions. This can help combat the affinity bias that we talked about too. Assess your friend groups. Are they mostly composed of people who think and look like you? Um, and then nurture the motivation to reduce unconscious biases by setting intentions to just practice self compassion and mindfulness with yourself. And then you can also go online and you can do IAT test. These are implicit bias tests. Um, and they will uncover things that you consciously try to hide. And the purpose is not to suppress biases, because suppressing is actually counterproductive and leads to a tremendous tax on mental bandwidth, which actually distracts from what you really want to do. So practice compassion, be very mindful and aware. And if you do happen to make a microaggression or say something that's insensitive, take accountability and apologize. And ways that you can address microaggressions, if you do see them happen in the moment, recognize that even well-meaning people commit microaggressions, whether they intended or not, is one. So you want to be compassionate with that. Ask for help and understanding if you made a microaggression. If you notice a negative reaction to something you said, ask if you've done something wrong or apologize and understand how it felt to the recipient. Don't get defensive. Just sit with what you've said for a minute and try to think about how it might feel for the recipient to have heard it. And acknowledge that the recipient is hurt and validate their feelings, apologize and reflect. All right. So I know we're kind of on time, but we have two more slides that we're going to go through. And this one is effective communication to address systemic racism and unconscious biases, and just to boost cultural sensitivity when communicating with others. And it's a DEAR man, it's an acronym. The DEAR is what you say, the man is how you do it. So the first letter is D, which stands for describe. Describe the current situation, stick to the facts, tell the person exactly what you're reacting to. So I tell people that you want to be as objective when you're describing. So for example, you made a comment that women should come in later during the work meeting on Monday, right? You said the time of day, what was said, just describe it right out. You wouldn't want to say what you said was sexist. And we'll get to that. Then the E stands for express. Express your feelings and opinions about the situation. Don't assume that the other person knows what you think. So you can say something along the lines of, when you said that comment, I felt inferior and felt singled out due to my gender. Third is assert. Assert your needs by asking for what you want, saying no clearly, but don't assume the other person's going to know what you want. So I would appreciate if you refrain from making comments that single out others based on gender. And then the last thing you want to do is reinforce. Reinforce or reward the person ahead of time by explaining the positive effects of getting what you want, but you can also clarify the consequences. When you make comments that are not based off gender and use inclusive language, I feel valued and better able to focus on my work. And then the man part. This is something that you could use these skills with anything. But the M stands for mindful. Be a broken record. Ignore attacks. Just keep your focus. So if someone says, well, you said blah, 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 you just tell them, you know what? I want to acknowledge what you want to talk about, but can we focus on this for right now? And I have no problem circling back. A stands for appear confident, right? You don't want to be like looking everywhere. And you could also do this in an email if it's better, but you want to have great eye contact, really confident physical manner. And you don't want to be staring or stammering, but you want to appear confident. And the very last one is negotiate. Be willing to give to get. So I understand that may have not been your intention, but this is how I feel. If you're having trouble understanding We could discuss with this with management. So this is a really quick um, communication skill that can be very helpful. Here are some cultural sensitive communication tips. Be curious, listen, ask questions. Focus on listening and asking questions. Refrain from teaching them about your perspective. Make it clear discrimination is a part of a large society that needs to be reformed. Acknowledge any name calling or other discriminatory acts that you notice, right? So if issues arise, if either unnoticed or not discussed, no one ever gets handled, it just continues to fester. Go beyond expressing prejudice results from ignorance to avoid anger bias effects, and pay attention to multiple attributes of a person at once. Refrain from immediately stating your opinions, rather be curious and explore their knowledge about certain things, inquire about their perspective, and take advantage of topics they already are interested in to utilize metaphors or highlight possible commonalities with racism or sexism to help expand their understanding or introduce them to a different perspective. And sometimes you can offer support just by asking and actively seek out anti racist role models in your community, social media, or broader society. And then a couple of other things too is acknowledge and honor multiple religious and cultural practices and take into account language barriers and preferences. So sometimes you might have to offer translation services, educational opportunities to learn new languages, and also ensuring that you hire individuals that speak more than one language. Awesome. So that is the talk for today. Thank you so much. My name is Dr. Tiffany Loggins. I also have a book if you're interested. But it was a pleasure spending this time with you, and I hope that this was helpful.